one of the most painful experiences isn't being rejected. It's being misunderstood. Because rejection is obvious. You know where you stand. But being misunderstood is different. You explain yourself. You choose your words carefully. You genuinely try to help people understand what you mean. And somehow, they walk away with the exact opposite impression. Maybe you've experienced this before. Someone called you cold when you were simply quiet. Someone said you were overthinking when you were trying to understand. Someone accused you of being distant when you were actually protecting your peace. After enough moments like these, it's easy to start questioning yourself. Am I explaining things badly? Am I just too complicated? Why does this keep happening? But what if you've been asking the wrong question? What if the issue isn't that people refuse to understand you? What if they simply experience the world very differently from the way you do? Because people with rare intelligence often process thoughts, emotions, and relationships in ways that aren't immediately visible. They spend more time reflecting before speaking. They notice patterns other people overlook. They feel things they can't always explain. And when your inner world is much deeper than what appears on the surface, misunderstanding becomes almost inevitable. Not because you're broken, not because you're difficult, but because people can only understand what they have the experience to recognize. Today, we'll explore why people with rare intelligence so often feel misunderstood, and why that feeling may say less about your ability to communicate than you have believed for years. Part 2. It's not that you explain poorly. Your mind is processing more than people can see. If you've ever felt misunderstood, chances are you've turned the blame inward at least once. Maybe I didn't explain it clearly enough. Maybe I chose the wrong words. Maybe I should have just stayed quiet instead of trying. These thoughts are incredibly common, and for many people, that's where the reflection ends. But psychology offers a deeper perspective that often goes unnoticed. Misunderstanding isn't always the result of poor communication. Sometimes it's the result of two people processing the same reality in completely different ways. Imagine two people watching the same movie. One is focused on the action, the plot twists, the visible events unfolding on screen. The other is quietly observing the emotional undercurrents, the subtle shifts in tone, the unspoken tension between characters, the meaning behind each pause. Neither perspective is wrong. They're simply tuned into different layers of the same experience. This difference becomes even more noticeable in everyday interactions. People with rare intelligence often perceive details that others overlook. They don't just listen to what is being said. They notice how it's being said. They pick up on hesitation, slight changes in tone, fleeting facial expressions, and inconsistencies between words and emotions. All of these signals are processed almost instantly, often without conscious effort. The challenge is that most of this processing remains internal. When they finally speak, they present a conclusion that feels obvious to them. But to others, it can seem sudden, unsupported, or even confusing. So when you say, "I don't think he's being honest," or "something about this doesn't feel right," people might assume you're jumping to conclusions. What they don't see is the complex web of observations your mind has already connected. And that's why people with rare intelligence often feel misunderstood, not because they lack the ability to communicate, but because they perceive far more than can easily be translated into words. Sometimes, the real difficulty isn't having deep insights. It's finding someone who can understand the invisible path that led you there. Part 3. People often judge your conclusion, but they never see your process. Here's something I've noticed. When people misunderstand you, it's usually not because they disagree with your conclusion. It's because they never saw how you got there. Imagine someone solving a difficult puzzle. You only see the final answer. You don't see the hundreds of small pieces they connected first. That's what it can feel like for people with rare intelligence. Their minds are constantly collecting information. A small change in someone's voice, a look that lasts a little too long, a sentence that doesn't match a person's actions. One detail doesn't mean much on its own, but when enough of them come together, a pattern begins to appear. The strange part is that this process happens so naturally that it's difficult to explain. Sometimes you just know something feels off, not because you have proof, because your brain has quietly connected dozens of tiny signals in the background. Then you say something like, "I don't think this situation will end well," or "I have a bad feeling about this person." And people immediately ask, why? That's where the problem begins. You know the answer. You just can't explain every step that led you there. Personally, I think this is why many highly perceptive people eventually stop trying to convince everyone. Not because they think they're always right, because they've learned that some insights are easier to experience than to describe. And when other people can't follow your thinking, they often assume you never had a reason in the first place. That's why feeling misunderstood can become such a familiar part of life. Not because your thoughts don't make sense, but because most people only hear your conclusion. They never get to witness the quiet process that created it. Part 4. You feel more than you can easily put into words. There's another reason people with rare intelligence often feel misunderstood. Sometimes the problem isn't explaining what you think, it's explaining what you feel. Have you ever known something was wrong before you could explain why? You sensed a change in someone's attitude. You felt the atmosphere in the room shift. You noticed that something wasn't the same. But when someone asked, "What exactly happened?" you didn't have a clear answer, only a feeling, and that can be frustrating. Because from the outside, it sounds like you're guessing, but inside, it doesn't feel like a guess at all. It's the result of hundreds of tiny observations your brain has quietly collected. Personally, I think this is why so many highly aware people hesitate before speaking. Not because they don't have an opinion, because they know they can't fully explain everything their mind has already noticed. And if they've been misunderstood enough times, they start keeping those thoughts to themselves. Not out of fear, out of exhaustion. After a while, it feels easier to stay silent than to spend 10 minutes explaining something that still might not be understood. The difficult part is that other people often mistake that silence. They think you're distant, secretive, or emotionally closed off, when the truth may be the exact opposite. You care deeply. You notice more than most people realize. You're simply trying to find words for experiences that don't always fit neatly into language. And perhaps that's why feeling misunderstood becomes so familiar. Not because you have nothing to say, but because some of the deepest things you experience are also the hardest things to describe. Part 5. The more you explain, the more misunderstood you sometimes feel. This may be one of the strangest parts of the experience. Most people believe that if someone misunderstands you, the solution is simple. Just explain it better. But if you've often felt misunderstood, you probably know it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the more you explain, the more confused the other person becomes. I've experienced this myself. There were times when I tried to explain exactly what I was thinking. I gave more examples, added more details, tried to make everything as clear as possible. But instead of helping, it only made the conversation more complicated. Eventually, I realized something. The problem wasn't a lack of words. The problem was that we were looking at the same situation through completely different lenses. People with rare intelligence often think in layers. One idea leads to another. One observation connects to a memory. That memory connects to a pattern. And before they speak, Their mind has already built an entire picture. The listener only hears the final sentence. They never see everything that happened before it. That's why explanations can sometimes sound like overthinking, not because they are unnecessary, because the other person never saw the hundreds of small pieces that made the conclusion feel obvious. If this sounds familiar, leave a 5 in the comments below. I'm curious how many times you've walked away from a conversation thinking, I know what I meant, I just couldn't make someone else see it. And maybe that's the real frustration. Not that people disagree with you, but that they never got the chance to experience the journey your mind took before you spoke. Part 6. After being misunderstood. Enough times, you stop explaining yourself. Something changes after you've been misunderstood enough times. At first, you keep trying. You explain your thoughts more carefully. You choose your words more slowly. You hope that this time, the other person will finally understand what you're trying to say. Sometimes they do, but many times they don't. And little by little, you begin to notice a new habit. You stop explaining, not because you've stopped caring, because you're tired. Personally, I think this is something many highly reflective people go through. It's not that they become quieter overnight. It's that they've learned not every conversation is the right place for everything they carry inside. So instead of saying what's really on their mind, they simply smile. They change the subject. Or they say, it's okay, even when it isn't. From the outside, people may think you've become distant, more private, less expressive. But what's really happening is very different. You've become more careful about who gets access to your inner world, because you've learned that being heard is not the same as being understood, and those are two very different things. The interesting part is that when you finally meet someone who truly understands you, everything changes. You don't have to search for the perfect words. You don't have to explain every detail. The conversation flows naturally. You feel lighter, safer, almost as if you've stopped translating your thoughts for the first time in years. Maybe that's what you've been looking for all along. Not more conversations. Just one where you can finally speak without feeling like you're being misunderstood every other sentence. Part 7. The person who understands you may understand very little about you. Here's the strange part. Feeling understood isn't always about finding someone who thinks exactly like you. It's about finding someone who's willing to understand before they judge. For years, I thought the right people would automatically understand me. If they cared enough, they'd just get it. But that's rarely how it works. Even the people who love you can misunderstand you. Not because they don't care, because they've never experienced the world the way you do. They don't notice the same details. They don't process emotions the same way. They don't spend hours reflecting on a single conversation. So when they respond differently, it doesn't always mean they don't value you. It may simply mean they're looking through a different window. I think realizing this changed the way I looked at relationships. Instead of expecting everyone to understand me, I started asking a different question. Who is genuinely trying to understand me? There's a huge difference. One person may never fully understand your inner world, but they'll listen. They'll ask questions. They'll stay curious instead of making assumptions. And honestly, that's often enough. Because people with rare intelligence usually aren't searching for someone who agrees with everything they say. They're searching for someone who doesn't immediately dismiss what they don't yet understand. When you find someone like that, something inside you begins to relax. You stop editing every sentence. You stop worrying about being too much. You stop feeling like you have to defend the way your mind works. Maybe that's why being understood feels so rare. It's not because people are unwilling to care. It's because true understanding begins with curiosity. And curiosity is much rarer than most people realize. Number, Part 8. Maybe you were never meant to be understood by everyone. There's one final thought that's worth considering before we end. Maybe the goal was never to be understood by everyone. For a long time, I thought it was. I believed that if I explained myself well enough, people would eventually see what I meant. But the older I get, the more I realize that's probably impossible. Every person sees the world through their own experiences, their own fears, their own beliefs. No matter how clearly you speak, people will always hear your words through the lens of their own lives. And that's okay, because not everyone is meant to understand you. The people who matter won't always understand every thought you have, but they'll make the effort. They'll stay, they'll ask one more question instead of making one more assumption. Personally, I think that's the difference between being accepted and being understood. Acceptance says, I like you. Understanding says, I want to know who you really are. And those are not the same thing. If you've spent years feeling misunderstood, don't let that convince you that you need to become easier to understand by pretending to be someone else. The right people won't expect you to become smaller. They'll simply be curious enough to meet you where you are. And sometimes, finding even one person like that can change the way you see yourself forever. Because in the end, feeling understood has never been about being seen by everyone. It's about finally being seen by the right person. Final thoughts. Maybe you were never too difficult to understand. If there's one thing I hope you remember after watching this video, it's this. Being misunderstood doesn't automatically mean you've explained yourself badly. Sometimes it simply means you've experienced something the other person has never experienced. For years, you may have blamed yourself. You may have thought you were too emotional, too intense, too complicated. Or maybe you started saying less because it felt easier than explaining yourself over and over again. But maybe none of those labels were ever the real problem. Maybe your mind has always noticed things that are difficult to put into words. Maybe you've always felt things before you could explain them. Maybe you've always been searching for understanding, not attention. And those are very different things. The truth is, people with rare intelligence don't usually feel misunderstood because they're poor communicators. They often feel misunderstood because much of what happens inside their minds is invisible. Other people hear the words. They don't hear the hundreds of quiet observations that came before them. So if you've spent years feeling like nobody truly understands you, don't let that convince you there's something wrong with you. The right people won't understand every thought you have, but they'll care enough to ask. They'll stay long enough to listen. And sometimes, that's where real connection begins. If this video resonated with you, leave an 8 in the comments below. I'd love to know how many of you have quietly carried this feeling for years without ever knowing how to describe it. And if you thought this video was really about being misunderstood, there's one more thing you should know. For many people with rare intelligence, this feeling didn't begin in adulthood. It began much earlier, long before work, long before relationships, long before they even had the words to explain it. In our next video, we'll explore why so many people with rare intelligence struggle to remember large parts of their childhood and how those early experiences may have shaped the way they think, trust, and connect with the world today. Because sometimes, the answer to who you are today begins with the parts of your past you can barely remember.